Welcome to today's Shape of the Museum. My name is Adam Levine, and I am Assistant Curator of European Art at the AGO. Before I introduce my guest, I want to acknowledge the land on which I'm living and working. The Art Gallery of Ontario operates on land that is the territory of the Anishinaabe-Mississauga Nation, and also the territory of the Wendat and the Haudenosaunee. The Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant is an agreement between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Anishinaabe Three Flyers Confederacy to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Toronto is also governed by a treaty between the federal government of Canada and the Mississaugas of the Credit Anishinaabe Nation. Toronto has always been a trading center for the First Nations. I am so excited to welcome Dr. Nancy Wu, Senior Managing Museum Educator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art's Cloisters. For over 20 years, Nancy has led the educational programming at the Cloisters, the Met's collection of medieval European art, set at the very northern tip of Manhattan. With Peter Barnett, she co-authored the definitive guide to the Cloisters buildings and its collections, which remains essential reading for lovers of medieval art. In addition to her museum education work, Nancy has had a parallel career as a scholar of French Gothic architecture. Recently, Nancy announced her plans to retire from the Met and pursue her research full-time. Just a quick note to everyone as we talk today, please make use of the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to ask us questions as we talk. We'd love to hear from you and incorporate your thoughts and questions into our conversation. Just to say, I have known Nancy for over a decade. I met her first when I was a college intern at the Cloisters Education Department, and not to be melodramatic, but a piece of offhand advice that she once gave me changed the path of my life altogether. So I'm very glad to sit down with Nancy to ask her about the topic most important to me. What do historic European collections in North American museums mean in a global or a cosmopolitan world? And how can these collections serve audiences from a diversity of backgrounds and experiences? And much more than anything, how can historians of the Middle Ages talk about globalism, cultural exchange, and ethnic diversity in a way that is more honest, nuanced, and inclusive? So that is our pretty heavy agenda for today. But first, I would love, before we jump in, to ask you a bit about, can you tell us about how you arrived to the Cloisters and to medieval art?
I will do this briefly because I really think our conversation today about the global Middle Ages is a very timely and important one. I was a graduate student at Columbia pursuing my PhD in art history and started lecturing at the Cloisters, as many of us did. And after I had gotten my degree, I was able to become a full-time member of the education office at the time. And this was in late 1998. So the rest is history, as they say. That's how I sort of joined the Cloisters family. I would like to say, Adam, that before we start looking at slides, which of course is very important to look at art, just sort of a few things that maybe you and I can talk about what we mean by global. I think that's a very important issue that we tackle. I use the word global myself, not merely as a geographic term, which it in a very narrow sense it is, but I really see it as a 360-degree, all-encompassing term to describe different ways of looking at objects and incorporating other people's notions and ideas and understandings of looking at art. I think our job as museum professionals is to identify and incorporate the universal values of the works of art that we work with, and figuring out how these universal values can be related to common notions that we all share with our visitors. And our visitors indeed come from everywhere of the globe. And so our task is really to have this intersection between the global appeals of our objects, and that's our job to identify those, and to identify and to appreciate the global backgrounds and experiences of our visitors. So it's a lot of observation, a lot of thinking, a lot of obviously understanding our own collection. For a collection like the Cloisters, which is specialized, which is medieval art and architecture, it has a lot to do with the history of this collection it was started out, as you know, Adam, by the American sculptor George Gray Barnard, who lived for a long time in France, who was a sculptor working with stone. So that sort of dictated his background, and his expertise dictated what he purchased, right? And for the past 80 plus years, the collection continued to grow, but it remains a medieval collection. However, now it's medieval from largely the 12th century through the 16th century, no longer very French, but it has objects from Central Europe, even some Eastern Europe. And also there are a handful of objects that are from the Islamic and Jewish cultures of the Middle Ages. So it is medieval in terms of its time period. It is European in terms of the geography that it represents, but it has grown and become much richer in terms of the objects. And it is our duty, I think, to not compromise the necessary information that we need to partake with our visitors about these objects. They are in the collection for good reasons, and they need to be understood in context. But then we need also to broaden this context to invite our visitors to be part of the context.
So we really have sort of two different approaches here, right? One is about speaking to a universality of human experience, and then the other is thinking about the object and the materials as being from maybe beyond Europe, or thinking about cultural exchange. And this is, I think, the fact that this is a conversation between an educator and a curator makes it even more rich, right? That a lot of this is about how these objects can be activated for audiences through education.
Right. So with your permission, I'm going to start sharing the
Please.
first. Sorry, I have to go back to the first one.
Everyone close your eyes for a second.
So I picked the first one because these are the two gardens at the cloisters. They are constructed cloisters using fragments from different locations, in this case in France. They're very, very noticeable. They're very much beloved by a lot of our visitors. And I think they obviously indicate the name. They are the namesake of the museum, because the museum has 4 of them. So the museum is called the Cloisters. Literally, they serve as the core of the architecture of the museum. And obviously, coming to this location, typically we would talk about monastic life and monastic architecture, which may or may not be familiar to some of our visitors, particularly those who are not coming from the Judeo-Christian background. But that is in no way a hurdle. I very much like to describe this area as an area designed to provide seclusion and privacy. And I think this is a notion everybody understands.
Absolutely. And the sort of monasticism is not also an exclusively European phenomenon.
Right.
You know, it's a tradition that's practiced elsewhere in the world. And the concept of the sort of medieval pleasure garden certainly exists outside of the bounds of the geographical bounds of Europe too, right? I think about, there's Buddhist monasticism in East Asia at the same exact time, but also in the Islamic world, the pleasure garden really becomes, I think, occupies a very similar place in the psyche as it does in Europe.
Right. And of course, the notion that the cloister is the nucleus of a monastic complex. Most people probably don't get to see a real monastic complex, but people have been to college campuses, hospital complexes, corporate headquarters, where you have a cluster of buildings serving different functions. So again, this is a notion that is easily understood if we explain the function of a cloister or of a monastery.
So with the, I know that the plantings in the Saint Michel de Cucha cloister are, sometimes they have modern hybrid plants, and they're not so strictly medieval, but in the cloister on the right, you know, it's a really fascinating place to think about globalism, because the horticulturalists at the cloisters have long planted that space with plants that are used for art making, for medicine, for foodstuffs. And so I've known that for at least for over a decade, I think
Mhm,
there have been
mhm.
ginger, cardamom, citruses, plants that would have been part of what we think of as cultural exchange, or specifically, that move that come from far beyond Europe.
Absolutely. What you're seeing in the middle of this garden, these are quince trees, right? So they're very Mediterranean, and the Mediterranean is a fabulous body of water, in my opinion, because it gives you European and Asian cultures. Think of the so-called Mediterranean diet, uh, and the same thing with plants. So absolutely, this is the place where everybody is at home and everybody is an expert. I can share a famous internal Cloisters quince pie recipe with visitors, and a visitor will tell me, well, but no, but my mother used to do it the other way. So everybody takes ownership walking into these gardens, looking at these plants. And also, it's not just for food stuff, also for medicine, right? Homeopathic is, again, a universal notion in many cultures. Herb medicine is very, very important, continues to be practiced today. So the garden, the cloister, is really a fabulous, I don't want to use the word icebreaker too casually, but it really is a place that allows everyone to open up, to have something to offer, to have something to share. And I also want to point out, you notice at both of these gardens, a source of water in the center. On the left in Kusha, it's a fountain from Saint-Genis de Fontaine. And on the right is a wellhead from Venice. And let's not forget that water is also very important. To have clean water was a struggle in the Middle Ages. I mean, we all can picture that. So in the 12th century Pilgrim's Guide, for example, the author cautioned pilgrims on their arduous journey to Santiago de Compostela to avoid eating fish from a particular river because that river is somehow poisonous, or to not touch a particular well. And this is a problem. To have safety, to have safe water, clean water to use and to drink continues to be a problem today. Think of the citizens of Flint in Michigan, right? They're still struggling to have clean water coming into the pipes into their homes. So I think there's just so many things that we can connect with people in terms of what we want to teach them about the Middle Ages, but how they can relate to their life today in 2020.
I'm so glad that you bring up pilgrimage, because I think that pilgrimage is a really critical tool for us in terms of myth busting a bit. And the myth that concerns me the most about how people conceive of the Middle Ages and of Europe is that Europe is operating in a cultural vacuum, and that people really did not travel extensively in Europe for the long period that we call the Middle Ages. And as a result, that everything that comes out of Europe in the Middle Ages is sort of exclusively European. And the Cloisters is an amazing place to study pilgrimage and to learn about the extent to which people were much more mobile and went to places that they conceived of as deeply foreign to them, which I think is also a pretty universal human experience, right?
It certainly is, and I would like to I would like to comment at least two colleagues, and there are many more. For example, two recent special exhibitions at the Met produced by medieval curators. One is the Medieval Jerusalem show, and the other one is the Medieval Armenian show. Both demonstrate how extensively people travel, obviously for different reasons, but the amount of commerce that took place, the amount of interaction between the many very peoples is something that we need to learn more, and we also need to propagate more to sort of get the word out that medieval Europe was not a contained prison, that it just stayed within itself. There was quite a bit of communication with the world outside of medieval Europe. I also love to talk about the attire of the pilgrim in the Middle Ages. I mean, we've seen many sculptures depicting pilgrims with their broad brim hat, with a stick, helping them with walking, wearing a coat that keeps them warm against the rain, and always with a water bottle. This is exactly how we go on a hike today. There's nothing unfamiliar about it, right? So another thing is, one of the challenges that I face with visitors is that how to make them feel comfortable with a collection that seems from a distant past, because there's so many things that we do today that have their roots in the Middle Ages. So again, it behooves us, it's our job as museum professionals to break that boundary, to invite our visitors into the medieval world and to demonstrate how relatable this world is to our own world.
I think the object that you have next is the perfect example of this, a great entry point. Oh, I love it so much. So please go ahead.
Well, again, I always talk about this object as an object of devotion, right? This depicts the Virgin Mary and her son. Her son is unfortunately largely disappeared. You can see his foot here, the child, the baby Jesus, but the body of Jesus is unfortunately lost. So by this point, this is sort of the early 14th century, most of our visitors, if they were to go through the galleries chronologically, would have seen quite a bit of 12th century, some early 13th century statues of the Virgin and Child. If they're depicted seated, they tend to be seated in a very frontal way, regal, a bit static, right? The Virgin would be sitting and carrying her son on her lap. And this is a very important way of showing the mother and child, the throne of wisdom type, which we don't need to get into now. But that type sort of dictates a lot of the sculptures that we see of the Virgin and Child. So here we come to a Virgin and Child where the mother, the Virgin, turns her face sideways and lowered her face to look at the child. And even though the child is no longer there, just from her smile, we know there's an interaction. It's a very intimate, loving relationship that the mother and child enjoy. So again, I ask, what can be more universal than the love between a mother and child? So for visitors, and I have had visitors coming to me, asking me, who is the Virgin Mary? They don't know anything about Christianity. That is fine, because everybody understands this important connection between a mother and a child.
So this is first and foremost it expresses a universal phenomenon of the parent-child bond, but it's also a deeply international object. The period around, in the 14th century is within medieval art history, has been called the Golden Age of Ivory. And this is African elephant ivory that would have been harvested in Southern Africa and brought to probably London by a network of Swahili-speaking maritime traders who traveled up the entire eastern coast of Africa, probably around the Strait of Gibraltar under Spain, and up along the west coast of the Iberian Peninsula to arrive in Northern Europe. This is an incredibly international object, and it's so fascinating to imagine that this is an object that really spans two continents, and the amount of labor by different workers that went into creating this object is, a sort of a deeply multicultural, multilingual phenomenon, and at a period where, as I said earlier, that visitors don't really think of. They think of the map or the potential for human mobility to be very small. This object is really a testament to these enormous networks of cultural exchange that transcend, this really limited notion of what people think the medieval world was like.
Absolutely. And if you think of paint pigment coming from plants or from mineral, one of the most important source of the color blue is, of course, lapis lazuli or ultramarine. And ultramarine basically means it comes from
Over the sea.
Over the sea, right? And of course, we all know that lapis lazuli was mined in today's northeastern Afghanistan. Marco Polo, on his travels, actually witnessed the mining of this particular mineral. So there's no lapis being used on this particular sculpture, but a lot of sculptures, medieval sculptures, have this blue color coming from lapis. Again, it's not an easy journey. It's over land, right? It's a very punishing landscape from Afghanistan, as we know, all the way to Western Europe, going through a lot of territories, going through a lot of middlemen. And the Armenian show from a year or two ago also taught us the role of the Armenians as merchants, as the middlemen, sort of making sure that commerce went smoothly between the two continents. So there's really a great deal of internationalism that we can talk about when speaking about medieval art.
We have a quick question about the object itself, which is one of our attendees wants to know if there used to be a throne or how, the Virgin is set up on the left, we see this in profile, it's seated on a really incredible invisible metal mount. But do you have any sense of what it would have looked like when it was originating?
There probably would be a some kind of a chair, a throne, right? But it's lost. Now, the photograph on the left shows you that the back does not seem as polished, as finished as the frontal view. So it has been suggested that the image, that the sculpture is probably meant to be seen as you would on the right. So that's the frontal, the primary view, and the left is sort of the back view, and the sculpture may be seated. There may be a throne, a chair, but may be placed in front of a niche or against a wall, so that the primary view is the view that is meant for us to enjoy. And I also show the left because you can see the color on the back is a lot darker than the color on the right. Now, ivory, as we know, this is not the natural color of ivory. The color would have been lighter. So it's being suggested that it's possible as a practice, and this was written in the 12th century by Theophilus, that people would use some kind of a red pigment matter is one that's being mentioned, mixed with walnut oil to polish, to rub on the surface of the ivory, which was a desired look. Now the back is much darker, and it's being suggested that the back might have been exposed to some kind of a heat source, maybe on the mantelpiece of somebody's home. I don't know, we don't know, but that seems to have come from a different reason.
This object is so provocative. We're getting tons of questions. One that is, I think, a great question is that there's this hole sort of over her sternum. And obviously this piece has suffered a lot. We can see that one of the arms is missing at the dowel, but this hole, do you think that used to hold potentially a gem or?
Right, most definitely. And I'm really happy to have these questions, because another thing I do to connect people to our objects is to create some kind of a group activity where everyone can be involved. So for example, the observation of the color, I would say discoloration of the ivory surface, the observation that she ought to have had a chair of some sort, and the observation of the missing perhaps gem, perhaps a piece of crystal here. All of these things are observations that do not require any kind of prior art historical knowledge. So again, we can make people very comfortable to make these observations. And these observations are absolutely crucial to understanding this piece as an object.
One more question. A couple of questions. Is she missing a crown, and what is her size? The crown is a really interesting question because, like the hole at her chest, which probably held a gem. Many of these, the sort of Gothic era Virgin and Child statuettes had silver or gold crowns. So many of them are missing. I think it's really rare to have a surviving crown from the same period. But in a few, I've seen a handful of instances where there are 19th century crowns that have replaced them. Often there's even a little seam around the head that the crown would have rested on. And around size-wise, I kind of remember it being really
it's
big.
about this big. It's about maybe this big.
It's a lovely object. And it's
really
on you in the treasury usually.
Right.
So I'm worried about timing, because we have so much to talk about. So we should advance forward.
From ivory coming from Africa, I think we are coming to a particular subject matter that invites the depiction of non-Europeans in the composition. On the left is a stained glass from the Cloisters, and on the right is a beautiful, beautiful painting from the AGO, from the Art Gallery of Ontario. Adam, do you want to take over first?
Absolutely. I've been looking at our image on the right from the AGO for several months now. It's a cutout. It used to be, it's a manuscript illumination that used to be probably at the top left of a very large Italian choir book that was used in a monastery for the entire singing choir of monks to read from. And it's an initial, and inside we see a scene of the Adoration of the Magi, which is an episode that appears in the Christian Bible. The Christian Bible is effectively pretty vague about the actual circumstances of kings coming to visit the newborn Jesus and to bring him gifts. But over time, and certainly by 1300 and by 1507 with the Met image, certain ideas have really taken hold in popular culture about what this visit looked like. Namely that there were three kings, that they came from the sort of three known continents of Europe, Asia, and Africa. Sometimes that they represent the three ages of man, so a young man, a middle-aged man, and an older man, and that they bring invaluable gifts, frankincense, gold, and myrrh. And so in both of these images, we have one king, often called Balthazar, depicted as Black and meant to stand in for Africa. And they both of these images make use of the sort of European medieval image-making technique to suggest distance of the sort of snaking river from the bay. And they both have boats in the distance to show how far the kings have come, how far they have traveled to visit the newborn Christ.
It's really very interesting that water is so essential in depicting distance. And I remember when I first saw this image, when you emailed it to me, it took me a while to realize that this is a body of water, because then I figured out these are boats, these are vessels back there. And of course, the obligatory Star of Bethlehem that would guide the three wise men to this location. And as you said, Adam, the text is very vague, but then a visual tradition eventually began established, so that you have these sort of required elements, the three people, the three continents, the three ages, and also even the gifts that they bring. Myrrh, for example, it's a sap from a tree. It's from a tree that basically grows outside of Europe, and also frankincense. So this is a censer that indicates the gift that he is carrying. So these are actually things that are not indigenous to Europe. So this is a sort of more I don't want to use the word veiled, but a more subtle way to suggest that they come from very, very far away. But it's also very interesting because the AGO example is Italian and the Cloisters example is German. And the topography of Northern and Southern Europe got incorporated into the depiction when the story is supposed to take place in the Middle East. So this also brings to mind, I often think of this, that these are images meant to illustrate some kind of text. Now, our visitors may not know the text of this particular text, but I'm sure whatever cultures they come from, whatever countries they come from, there are important texts that have been illustrated in many different ways. The Tales of Genji is one that comes to mind. In Indian miniatures, South Asian Indian, there are a lot of miniatures that are meant to illustrate text as well. So again, there's something very universal about wanting to make into a visual object something that was originally written.
And I'm so glad that you point out that the geographic settings are German and Italian, in the same way that the people who are not Balthazar specifically are raced as European in these depictions. And I think obviously the social constructions of race in the ways that we live with them now are constructed after both of these works of art are made. But it's never been lost on me that Balthazar, when in the three kings are not only the different races, but also different ages of man. And Balthazar is always depicted as the youngest. So the African is the sort of least mature. And this does speak to contemporary ideas around civilization that are already in place in Europe in the late Middle Ages.
And if I may plug a little bit of commercial here, since the Metropolitan Museum has just reopened, we have another example. It's a three-dimensional freestanding sculpture of Balthazar that is now at the Met in the Medieval Sculpture Hall in an installation that is that belongs to a series called the Crossroad installations, combining objects from different cultures and different time periods. And that Balthazar from 15th century Germany stands right next to an African sculpture. So I think there are just many provocative ways of juxtaposing objects from different cultures to elicit discussion and understanding.
While we're plugging, I'll say that next week at this time, I'll be in conversation with Dr. Andrea Acci, who is one of the curators that worked on that exact exhibition. So if you want to hear more about that, same time next week.
Shall we move on, Adam?
Please.
Okay. So this is Adam's request. He wants to see this beautiful effigy of a knight. When Adam was an intern, I think we still called him Jean, of the Dalui family. But after much more research, and this is Barbara Bame's work, we have decided it's not clear which member of the family this gentleman was. John II Dalui, died in 1248. We know that for sure. On the same year, his son, Yu, went on a crusade to the Holy Land. And by 1267, Yu's daughter completed a transaction for the family. So the question is whether Yu had passed away by 1267 that required his daughter to be the head of the house, so to speak, to do that transaction for the family. So now the dating has been modified to reflect this knowledge and also to reflect the fact that we really don't know whether this is Jean, the father, or Yu, the son. Both of them had their effigies placed in the monastery, the Cistercian monastery, where they were kept until the French Revolution, when the monastery was pretty much destroyed. So I think, Adam, this piece has a lot to do with the global Middle Ages, in part because this was a traveler. Whether this was the father or the son, both as a family tradition of the men had gone on the Holy Land. So they were travelers. And this one obviously was a knight. He's probably attired as a knight, carrying a sword here. So this sword has been studied, particularly the hilt, right here, studied by a curator in the Arms and Armors collection, published in the early 1990s, discussing the style of this hilt, which is very non-European of the 13th, 14th centuries. Now I put here a stained glass panel actually at the cloisters right above this effigy. So it really helps me to do this comparison when I'm in the building. So here is a 14th century stained glass of St. George, another warrior. A typical European sword at the time would have a very simple sort of a straight guard. And then there's a grip, which is just a stick. And then here is the pommel, which is usually a disc-shaped element. Here we have not a straight stick of a guard. This guard, I always call this, it looks like a mustache to me. Anyway, it's a fairly complex design of a guard. And the grip is wrapped with very intricate patterns, which is also not terribly characteristically European. And this is also very interesting. The pommel, the fancy term is trilobate. It basically means it looks as if there are 3 leaves sprouting out from the grip. So this is very different. Both the pommel with a 3-leaf form and this kind of a guard have been found in Chinese paintings depicting people wearing swords. Not necessarily together, meaning sometimes the sword would have this, sometimes the sword would have that. And these paintings, the earliest one that has been observed dates from the 8th century. And into the modern period, into the 18th, 19th centuries, the Chinese continue to make reproduction swords that copied what they called ancient swords, and that continued this tradition of these decorative motifs. So again, the million-dollar question is, how did the sculptor know about a Chinese hilt? Is it because this member of the Daolui family picked one up from the travel? And how did the sword ended up wherever it ended up, all the way from China?
And of course, so we have Jerusalem as this, so the popular version of this, and what is the most enticing and also not improbable, is that Jean or Hugh of Alwi, when they went to fight in the Crusades and were in Jerusalem, would have had access to a shifted mercantile network of traders, right? That they would have been able to buy goods that had come to the Middle East from the Far East, and that their own travel sort of broadened their world. So to recap, so far we've looked at, we've talked about elephant ivory from Southern Africa. We've talked about Lapis Lazuli from Northern Afghanistan. And we're looking now at the potential of evidence of a Chinese sword having arrived via Jerusalem to France. These objects are so important because they radically reshape how we think of Europe and other geographies as being closed, fixed in place, insular, and not curious, and not mobile. And all of that really does get turned on its head when we look at the record, provided by the objects. Also, this object was took center stage in the wonderful Jerusalem exhibition that you mentioned earlier. Right. And before it went on view for that show, Lucretia Cargare, conservator at the Cloisters, cleaned it. And it's always been a really striking object. It's one of my favorite objects to bring people to see at the Cloisters, but it looks so remarkable after its treatment. It's just fabulous. And I think it's a really interesting, so far we've been talking only about objects from outside of Europe coming to Europe, but your research your next stage of research looks instead at Europeans leaving and going abroad. And I think this is so exciting because as you make this transition to become a full-time scholar, you're sort of in some ways returning to a sort of biographical note or a personal note in your study of the Middle Ages.
Returning to my roots, yes.
Can you tell us about that?
This is a tombstone. It's about this large. That was discovered in the 1940s, in 1946, I believe, by a high school history teacher in the city of Quanzhou, Quanzhou, in southeastern China. The city had a glorious medieval past. It was known as Zayton, Zayton, described by Marco Polo, described by Ibn Battuta. It is included in the Catalan Atlas, which says Zayton not once, but twice, next to an European-looking castle tower on the map. So it was a major international cosmopolitan seaport, the terminus of the maritime Silk Road. Basically, it was the spice route. So a lot of foreigners went there, the majority of whom were Muslims. These were Arab traders, merchants who lived there. Actually, they lived in several port cities in China. This was not the only one. 14th century China was ruled by the Mongols, and the Western Europeans, starting with Louis IX, actually, in the 13th century, had wanted to form an alliance with the Mongols, who had actually long accepted Nestorian Christianity. So the Western Europeans wanted to form an alliance through Christianity in its broadest definition with the Mongols that ruled China to basically sandwich the Muslims in the middle. So in 1307 or thereabout, Andrea of Perugia, a Franciscan, along with 9 other Franciscans, were sent by Pope Clement V to convert more Mongols in China. So they traveled via land, which was arduous. About 5 of them died already by the time they reached India, and the remaining 5 made it to today's Beijing. Andrea lived in Beijing for a couple of years, and then he went down south to Zayton, where he became the city's 3rd bishop. The Cathedral of Saito was actually endowed and built with money given by an Armenian noble lady, just to give you a sense of the international atmosphere of that port. So when this piece was discovered, it was when the city wall of Quanzhou was being demolished in the 1930s and 40s. And it was discovered that many tombstones belonging to foreigners, as I said, most of them are Muslims, had been used as building material when the city walls were being reinforced early on in the 15th, 16th centuries. So this particular tombstone is the least studied. The ones with Islamic inscriptions have been studied quite a bit. There are also a lot that belong to Nestorian Christians that have been studied, but this one has not. And I think in part because the inscription is practically impossible to read. Now we can make out this is a cross.
Yes.
This is probably Hic here.
Yes.
Now some people say this is Sepultus, buried. A British scholar in the 1950s claimed this is the Roman numeral 1332. I still have a hard time seeing that. Some people say this is Andreas Perusinus. I don't know. I find it very difficult to understand. But because it's very difficult to decipher, and because the Franciscan mission was not a successful one, soon after this guy died, and he died, obviously he died there because his tombstone was there. Basically the Franciscans sort of concluded their mission, and no Catholics went to China again until the 16th century. But that time it was the Jesuits who went to China. So my personal connection is that high school teacher who discovered the hundreds of tombstones that are today in the Maritime Museum was a granduncle of mine. His father and my great-grandfather were brothers. And my father was born in the city of Quanzhou. So it's a personal connection, but also it's a professional connection. I have spent the past 30 years or so of my life studying medieval Europe, and Perugia definitely is part of medieval Europe, a Franciscan. And now he showed up in my ancestral city.
Yes.
I want to know more about him. I really do. So this is a project that I have started, but I will dive in full time when I retire.
This is so exciting, and it feels frankly poetic that that it should arrive in this way. So it's made of stone. Are those swans at the top?
You won't believe it. These are angels.
Ah,
These are angels. There's a Sanskrit term, but they are these flying celestial beings in Buddhist art, right? So, and this, we don't know what this is. This could be for Nestorian tombstones. Usually this middle section is a lotus flower at the bottom supporting a cross. But because this tombstone lacks that identifier, and because of the Latin, it's sort of generally accepted as the Franciscan tomb.
A very trusted colleague in Leuven suggests that a 3D visualization could be helpful for the deciphering of the inscription.
Yep.
I think that's a great thought to think about scanning the object. And I'm so excited to watch this research unfold. And I think that it also plays, it will help us to move beyond mythologies, right? I think Marco Polo sort of tends to be the entirety of what we have in the popular imagination around Europeans in medieval China, and the fact that this, that story really doesn't offer any insight into the presence of Muslim traders living in China. It sort of limits and it sort of sensationalizes some really important realities of how much people traveled and how much people understood that there was a larger world that they were a part of, and that people sort of across the globe lived in ways that were, they had universal experiences, and there were also cultural specificities that guided their lives.
I know we're running out of time, but I really want to say that Marco Polo to me is a problem, because he described this town very carefully before he left China, but he said not a word about having met a Franciscan or an Italian. And we know that in that time, Saito had quarters for foreigners to live in. There was a Muslim quarter, there was probably a Western quarter. Definitely we know that there were three, not one, but three churches, one of which was a cathedral. So how is it that Marco Polo did not mention anything about the presence of the Franciscans or churches in the city? So there's a lot of work to be done.
This is great, because I think it really taps into these questions of like, why are these mythologies still so stubborn and persistent, and why do they continue to guide how we think about the Middle Ages? And I think that they can help us also to live in the present in a way that is informed, and that helps us to kind of think of ourselves as global citizens. I regret that we've run out of time, because talking to you is always so informative and expansive and interesting. And I hope that everyone that's tuned in has enjoyed learning from this conversation as much as I have. Thank you, Nancy.
And thank you for this opportunity, Adam.